Welcome to the Somerset History Channel. I'm Mr. T. This is our first video. Please let us know how we do. Before we left for break, we were talking about reforms. As in reform, changing something to make it better. Specifically, we were talking about the reforms that took place as a direct result of the Second Great Awakening. Now, easily the most controversial of these 19th century reform movements was abolition, the push to end slavery. While the cruelty and injustice of slavery seem very obvious to us today, it's important to know that it took nearly 100 years of efforts of abolitionists and fighting the deadliest war in our nation's history to finally bring an end to the practice of slavery in the United States. Today's video will examine the history of abolition in the United States. We'll look at why the practice of slavery was so entrenched in American life. The origins of abolition in the United States began in the colonial era with the Quakers, who opposed slavery and believed in equality of all due to their religion. Each of the 13 colonies had allowed slavery, but when the United States was being created during the American Revolution, the issue of slavery was becoming a touchy subject, quickly dividing the new nation. On July 4th, 1776, the most famous document in American history was written, the Declaration of Independence. You could look at the Declaration as our country's mission statement. It tells the world what the U.S. is about. The lines where you could see this most clearly are in the Declaration of Natural Rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration is an awesome document. It tells the world that we're born free and created equal. We're overthrowing British tyranny, and we're tired of being a slave to the crown. The U.S. is fighting for its freedom. But were we really, though? The big question that ends up coming up is, if we're fighting for freedom, should we be owning people? The best example of this inner conflict can be seen with Thomas Jefferson. It is unclear who Jefferson was talking about when he wrote those famous words, all men are created equal. Years later, people like Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King will use Thomas Jefferson's words to get America to finally live up to the great ideals our nation was built on. So, we win the war, get more land, go America. Now we need to set up a new government. By the time the U.S. Constitution was being debated, 5 northern states had abolished slavery. The Northwest Ordinance went a step further and even banned the spread of slavery into any of the newly added territories north of the Ohio River. For the new Constitution to take effect, they needed at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify it. That meant they needed Southern support. To avoid any controversy and get the South to support the new Constitution, the word slave is never mentioned once in the entire document. Instead, founding fathers used terms like other persons and such persons to describe the nearly 700,000 enslaved African Americans. The Constitution just put off the problem of slavery for 20 years by promising to eliminate the slave trade in 1808. And we all know how great things go when you keep ignoring a problem. Eliminating the slave trade was a good idea in theory, but the result replaced the old cruelty of the Middle Passage with new cruelties. It led to human trafficking, smuggling slaves into the U.S., and breeding people to be sold into slavery for profit. The Constitution ended up protecting the institution of slavery by strengthening the political power of slaveholding states through the Three-Fifths Compromise. This made the abolitionist fight even more difficult. For those of you that recall, the Three-Fifths Compromise settled how slaves would be counted when determining how many representatives a state could get in Congress. An individual slave counted as 3/5 of a person. This meant every 50 slaves a state had would count as 30 people. This counting took place even though slaves themselves could not vote or retain legal rights. For slaves, the Three-Fifths Compromise only magnified the representation and political voice of the white men who owned them. Slaveholding states benefited tremendously from this. The influence of the South could be seen in both Congress and the presidency. In 1793, slaveholding states gained 14 of the 105 representative seats by counting slaves using the Three-Fifths Compromise. With this additional political power, it's of little surprise that 4 of the first 5 presidents were slave owners from Virginia. Even so, the economic profitability of slavery was declining. As the year 1800 approached, many people even thought the institution was on the way out. Slavery and the cash crops it produced desperately required new lands in order to continue being profitable. Since the days of Jamestown, the main crop which relied on slavery was tobacco. An unexpected effect of this crop was that it depleted the soil. Slavery was on the decline until 1793. You see, the Industrial Revolution led to the creation of textile mills in Britain and the Northeast United States. There was a huge demand for cotton to be used in these factories. The only problem was it was extremely labor intensive to process cotton. That's where Eli Whitney comes in. He developed an invention which reduced the amount of labor needed to process cotton. Some hoped this mechanization to process cotton could lead to the end of slavery. It had the exact opposite effect. Because less labor was needed to process the cotton, more slaves were used to cultivate the land to increase the yield of cotton produced. This set King Cotton on the road to being the #1 U.S. export. Cotton was at the center of the U.S. economy and even put the U.S. on the world economic map. Suddenly, settlers hoped to move from the upper South to the lower South. The only thing needed to make this happen was more cheap land. One man that became associated with clearing the land needed to move westward is Andrew Jackson. During the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson fought against Native Americans like the Creek. After the war, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans continued to fight to open lands for American settlers. Jackson was involved in the Seminole Wars and even invaded Florida, forcing Spain to sell to the U.S. There were rumors that some of Jackson's efforts were tied to land speculation for himself and his friends, but he was exonerated by the House of Representatives. Even Jackson himself set his hermitage up to be a cotton plantation, benefiting from the newly cleared lands. As slavery began to expand, so did its opposition. One of the first examples of opposition to slavery is the American Colonization Society, which was created in 1817. They did not believe freed slaves could be integrated into American society. Instead, they set up a colony on the coast of Africa in 1822. Some people saw sending freed slaves back to Africa as necessary due to racial intolerance. However, many abolitionists saw this as a method of preserving slavery by removing the freed people that could fight against it. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass argued that America was the native land of African Americans and that they had had a hand in building it. It was no secret that over 200 enslaved people worked to build the White House and Capitol building, which are the center of our government. Society was changing dramatically during the 1800s. Things like industrialization and the problems that came with it led to a renewed push to go to the church. The Second Great Awakening was a call for individuals to do God's work by reforming society. Women, especially those from Quaker churches, saw slavery as a sin and began working to end it. To recap, on today's episode, we saw how slavery has been around in America since the colonial era, when the first slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619. The Quakers were among the first to fight against it, but southern states protected it with the political power they gained from the Three-Fifths Compromise. Even so, we saw how slavery looked like it could have been on the way out That is, until the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney and cotton plantations spread across newly opened lands in the Deep South. We saw how one of the first ways to address this issue of slavery was colonization, and how many abolitionists disagreed with having to leave the country they had helped build. In our next video, we will see as the profits from cotton grew, so did the fighting between pro-slavery and abolitionist forces. This violence continued to escalate until finally a civil war. Thank you for watching, and keep learning history.